this out. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Perfect, thanks. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me today and taking the time to join this talk. And I know everyone's feeling a bit Zoom fatigued, so thanks for coming along. My name's Alice Lawrence. I'm a research assistant at the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication. And my background is actually in conservation, so it's really great to be able to speak to you today. So just in case you don't know who the Winton Centre is, we're a team that you can see here. There's a couple more of us now. This photo is slightly outdated, but we're led by Dr. Alexandra Freeman, who's up here in the lovely purple trousers, and Sir David Spiegelhalter down here. And our aim is to help people make decisions by giving them the facts and evidence they need in a clear and balanced way. And the aim of our risk and evidence communication is always to inform them, but not persuade them. And we're a multidisciplinary team made up of researchers, science communicators, and software developers. And we undertake a variety of projects, ranging from those which are more research focused to those which are more applied. And we work in fields such as journalism, law, policy, and medicine. So turning to the talk today, in this talk, I'll be walking you through a genetics related case study where we successfully used a user-centered design approach, as well as talking to you about the use of design approaches and thinking in sustainability and conservation specifically. So hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be confident enough to employ a user-centered design approach, perhaps with a little extra reading, as well as develop some further understanding of different design approaches and of design thinking, and be able to identify where you could use these approaches and this thinking in your work if applicable. So I'm aiming for around 45 minutes of me talking, and then as comes we'll have time for questions at the end. So firstly, just to define design. So design is a task in which people seek to understand, interpret, and ultimately address a challenge or opportunity. And they do this by developing and creating things. These things could be of many different varieties. So you could have products such as websites or apps, as well as services and interfaces. And they design these products to create a better future reality, essentially. And the aim of our project, the case study I'll be talking to you about today, was to design a report to communicate BRCA1 genetic test results. And we saw this as important as in recent years, as I'm sure you know, there's been a huge increase in genetic testing capabilities. And this has put a lot of pressure on existing specialist genetic services, as well as meaning that a greater number of non-specialist clinicians are actually handling those genetic test results. However, for genetic testing to be as beneficial as it can be for patients, results need to be actioned appropriately by clinicians, and also the information disseminated accurately to patients and their families. So we began a project which aimed broadly to improve the actionability and understandability of genetic testing reports for non-specialist clinicians and patients. And we'd previously used user-centered design to improve cystic fibrosis genetic reports, and that's what this paper relates to here. And we'd found through a quantitative survey that the user-centered design report actually performed better on a number of outcomes compared to the original report. So, working with the East Midlands and East of England Genomic Laboratory Hub, we use the same process to work on BRCA1 genetic reports. What is BRCA1? I hear you cry. So just a little bit of background. So if someone has tested positive for BRCA1, it means that they have alterations to their breast cancer 1 gene. So that's where BRCA comes from, breast cancer. And there is a BRCA2, but here we'll just focus on BRCA1. And BRCA1 is responsible for repairing DNA. It's known as a tumor suppressant gene. So alterations to this gene are associated with different types of cancers. And as you can see here, females who have that alteration their risk of breast cancer actually increases from around 13% to 55 to 72%. And for males, that risk also increases from 0.1 to 1% of getting breast cancer in their lifetime. Regarding ovarian cancer, around 1.2% of females in the general population develop ovarian cancer. But if someone has that BRCA alteration, 39 to 44% of those women, of those females, will develop it. And there's also increased risk of prostate and pancreatic cancer. As you all know, if there's alterations to your genes, that's going to be hereditary. So you have a 50% chance of passing that alteration onto your children. So as you can see, this is quite a serious condition, which can actually have massive repercussions for people's lives and the lives of their families. So we used user-centered design, as I mentioned, and this term was actually coined by Donald Norman and Stephen Draper in 1986. And Donald Norman was actually the first user experience lead at Apple, the technology company. So he's actually quite a big name in the design industry. And user-centered design essentially aims to understand the needs and interests of the user. And users are actively involved in the design process. So for example, they might find and resolve errors. And this is a continuous iterative process. As you can see on the right-hand side here, it begins with understanding the context. Next, you want to specify those user wants and needs, so their requirements. Thirdly, produce design solutions, and fourthly, evaluate those solutions against the requirements. And you essentially undergo this iterative process until you have a successful design solution. So in our case study, we had 4 user groups, and these were the public with and without genetics experience, and clinicians with and without genetics expertise. And also throughout this process, we were in continuous consultation with the East Midlands and East of England Genomic Laboratory Hub, so we could draw on their expertise. So looking at the first 2 steps, in order to understand the context and also understand user requirements, we undertook a literature review. And here we gathered kind of examples of different genetic reports from the academic literature, but also from direct-to-consumer testing. So things like Mean 23. Sorry, I've actually forgotten the name of it. So we wanted to further understand the context by undertaking that literature review, but also we undertook some semi-structured interviews, again, to learn about the context, but hear more about people's experiences with, genetic reports, experiences that they'd had, and also to understand what they wanted from a report. And we use those previously collected examples to as kind of tools for them to say, I like this bit, I don't like this is useful, this not so much. And lastly, we used an online questionnaire to again gain further insight into what aspects of the report were useful for users. So for example, we thought maybe it would be a good idea to include a graphical representation of risks. And in this questionnaire, that's one of the things we asked, whether that would be useful. And the interviews and questionnaire participants represented our 4 user groups that I mentioned earlier. So when we'd undertaken these first 2 steps, we essentially devise our design solutions. So you can see in the middle here that comments that users had made, pointing to essentially how we satisfied those wants and needs. And now we had a prototype to test. And in order to evaluate our prototype, again, we used semi-structured interviews and online questionnaires. However, this time we used interviews as a more formative, kind of ongoing form of evaluation, and the questionnaire as a final summative evaluation. And for example, if you were designing, so this is just a document we're talking about here, that if you were designing an interface or a tool, there will be other and more appropriate ways for you to evaluate that product. So for example, user walkthroughs where you're essentially observing users using that interface or tool. In terms of the formative evaluation, we undertook 4 rounds of interviews, and in each round we had 8 to 12 participants, and that was a combination of our 4 user groups. And just to show you here, this is an excerpt from the interview guide that we used. And as you can see, we led the participant through each section of the report and asked them questions around understanding, usefulness, etc., and as well as the participants having opportunities to provide any general feedback that they had. And although we asked questions about the reports, as I mentioned visualizations earlier, we also asked them questions around understanding those visualizations. So after we undertook the interviews, we transcribed them and extracted any comments pertaining to any confusions participants might have had, any suggestions they had, or misunderstandings of the reports. And we can see some examples here. So we have the number of participants who mentioned the comment itself in the middle column, and the outcome in the right-hand column. And just to note, we did, when we were inputting these comments into our spreadsheet, we did write the participant number and the line number of the transcript, just so if anybody needed to refer back to the original text, then that was there. So when we decided to action a comment or not, we used a combination of our own judgment, actually what we could physically do, so what we had the power to change, as well as drawing on the expertise of those at the Genomic Laboratory Hub. So you can see here in the top row, we actually took no action for this comment because it was an NHS level decision, so it wasn't our decision to make. And just thinking about undertaking this in a conservation setting, barriers to implementing user feedback might be things like cultural or religious beliefs, and maybe these kind of things would make design change inappropriate in a conservation setting. So we did 4 cycles of understanding more about the context, specifying the user's wants and needs via the interviews, changing the reports to meet those requirements, and evaluating them again through the interviews. And so you can use what are called severity ratings to know when to stop your rounds of formative evaluation. Otherwise, you could just carry on forever, which wouldn't be a very effective use of time and money. So there are different types of severity ratings you can use, but you just need to be consistent about which one you use. So for example, if you wanted to grade the comments against user experience, you can see on the left, then you could classify them as an irritant, moderate, severe, or unusable issue. For example, a severity rating 1 could be more of a cosmetic problem, but a severity rating 4 might be refusal of the user to engage with the product or part of the product because of its design. And there are other ways of classifying the severity of issues. So looking at the middle section there, if you wanted to incorporate the frequency of the issue, you could use this matrix to classify those issues. And if you wanted to consider other factors such as cost of implementation, then you could essentially rate those different factors, a low, medium, high, add those up, and you'd have a severity rating. So that's it in terms of the formative evaluation. And I mentioned we undertook that final kind of evaluative step, the summative evaluation, where we used an online questionnaire. And in the questionnaire, we compared the reports currently in use, which you can see at the top here, with our user-centered design reports. And we compared these against 4 outcomes: actionability, comprehension, communication efficacy, and perceived risk. And to do this, we recruited 456 participants through the survey company Respondee, and we ensured that these participants were representative of the UK on age, gender, and education. So just to briefly show you the results of these questions, the questionnaire that we conducted. So where multiple items were used, these items are averaged to give the x-axis. So for actionability, that's essentially asking, is the user confident in the actions that they need to take next, essentially? And to measure this, we used a scale that was made up of 5 items, each of which were rated on a 7-point Likert scale from not at all to completely. And examples of these items include: how clear are you about the next steps that you could take, or how ready would you feel to take any next steps? And as you can see here, we've got the control, so the original report in blue, and the user-centered design report in orange, and these stars here are denoting any significance that was found. So you can see that the user-centered design reports actually performed significantly better in terms of actionability. And moving on to subjective comprehension, here we asked how well did you understand the information and how clear is the information on the first page of the report, because that's where the result was placed, so that was important to know. And again, we used a 7-point Likert scale with the average taken. And again, you can see that the user-centered design report actually performed significantly better than the control. We did take some objective comprehension measures, but these didn't actually form a reliable and valid scale, so they had to be analysed individually. So for the sake of time, I haven't included those here. So turning to communication efficacy, so how efficient the communication was essentially, this scale was made up of 18 items, each with a 4-point Likert scale. And these included questions about how satisfied the user was with different aspects of the report, how easy it was to find and understand information, and how effectively the report communicated certain information. And again, as you can see, our user-centered design report performed significantly better than the control, which was great. And lastly, with perceived risk, we asked one question for this, and it was essentially how likely is it that the woman whose report this is will develop breast or ovarian cancer sometime in her lifetime. And we had a 7-point scale ranging from very unlikely to very likely. And it was hypothesized that the user-centered design report would have a higher perceived risk as the risk would be being communicated more clearly, essentially. But here we found no significant difference between the two reports. So on to the next step of this project. So we've undertaken the user-centered design process. We have a report which is significantly better on some outcomes that we decided were important. And now we're looking to implement these reports. So our team is currently in conversations with the Genomic Laboratory Hub about getting these reports essentially put into the system so they can be beneficial to patients. And just some final thoughts on this process before I turn to the design approaches and the use of them in sustainability. So I think it's really important to pay attention to the diversity of your participants, and that's something that I think we definitely didn't do as well on in this study as we should have. So especially wanting to include, diverse perspectives and those hard to reach groups. And since this project, I've actually, worked a lot harder to include a more diverse range of participants in other projects. So it's definitely been a learning experience for me. And I think user-centered design is actually quite flexible. So in my opinion, at least, I think you can use the kind of time and resources that you do have, because I feel any kind of engagement with the user of your product is going to be valuable. I feel user-centered design is quite an accessible approach. So as long as you've got those more qualitative skills in terms of semi-structured interviewing, etc., I think this is an approach that most people could happily adopt and use well. And lastly, as I mentioned, I think it's really valuable to just engage with those users, not only because they're the ones that are going to be using your product and you want them to enjoy using it and it to be beneficial for them, but also we got quite a few insights just from engaging, for example, those clinicians who did have genetics expertise. So for example, someone told us that a lot of people actually think that men can't pass on a BRCA1 alteration because it's so heavily associated with breast and ovarian cancer. And we actually included that question in our objective comprehension kind of measure. And we found that people had more correct answers with the user-centered design report. And that was because we explicitly included that sentence that men can pass it on, but also it showed that quite a high percentage of people who viewed the original report got that question wrong. So you can get some really valuable insights from the users, which you can then incorporate into your product. Turning to design approaches, I will say that these different terms can be quite amorphous, so definitions may differ depending on where you read it. But from my interpretation, I just wanted to show you kind of the different approaches that you could take to design. Obviously, there are many, many more, but these are just the ones I thought that might be relevant for this. So along the bottom here, we've got increasing level of engagement, and I'll just run through them one at a time. So human-centered design is essentially where more emotional metrics are collected, such as mood, as well as psychological metrics. Here, functional preferences are collected from different users and different populations and incorporated into the product by designers. And designers are really trying to be empathetic here by engaging with those customers or that population as much as possible. And these design decisions are made with human needs and limitations essentially as the focus. So as an example, we know that as people get older, their eyesight deteriorates. So that's something that a human-centered designer might consider when they're designing their product. User-centered design, we just spoke about this. So psychological metrics are collected to evaluate the product. And again, those functional preferences are collected from the user and incorporated into the product by designers. And these preferences and any other kind of peculiarities specific to the target audience are gathered from a deep analysis of that target audience and are used by designers to make design decisions. And as I mentioned before, here the user needs and wants really are the focus. So these two terms, human-centered design and user-centered design, have actually been used interchangeably in the past. As I said, it's quite an amorphous kind of picture going on. And more recently, some people actually see them as one approach. So turning to service design, this is actually about looking holistically at a problem by examining the whole of a service, not just looking at a specific product. And here, various stakeholders who interact with that service are engaged throughout the design process, whereby designers listen to their thoughts and preferences as before, and these are then incorporated into the service by the designers. And again, a variety of evaluation metrics are used, such as psychological and emotional metrics. And turning to the box on the right-hand side, so here we've got more of a participatory approach. Some of you might have heard of co-design, and here those who gain from the product are given the role of experts of their own experience. And they collaborate with, so the stakeholders collaborate together with the designers during the design process. And use of co-design has actually been used in some kind of quite political moments. So for example, one of the first uses in Scandinavia was building collaborations between labor movements and academia to support stakeholder participation in the design of work environments. And here, differing from the other approaches, the designer undertakes the role of facilitator. So it's not the designer that's incorporating those preferences into the product. They're essentially facilitating the stakeholders to do that for themselves. And I did come across these interesting terms to describe people who think about these different design approaches in different ways. So the terms are splitters and lumpers. So splitters are those who talk about the differences between these approaches and see them separate, as I've set them out here. However, lumpers feel that there are kind of more similarities between these terms than there are differences, and it doesn't actually matter so much what you call the process. It's essentially the methods and techniques that you're using within that process that matter. And I do agree to some extent that these terms are very similar, and I think that they are more similar than different. However, as I mentioned, I think co-design is something that is a different concept, as here the designer does become that facilitator. They're no longer the ones incorporating stakeholder feedback into the design. So that's just to give you a very brief picture of different design approaches. As I said, there are many more out there, but I thought these might be of most relevance. So turning to design and sustainability, so the use of different design approaches has definitely increased within sustainability and conservation in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say. And the academic literature shows a variety of different design approaches being used to, for example, design decision support tools, as well as kind of citizen engagement apps, citizen science apps, and also kind of different websites and apps to engage conservation professionals with data. So as well as design of kind of interfaces and products, it's also been used in the design of programs and interventions. So just last year, Bowie et al. Looked to co-design a behavior change intervention, and also in the development of evaluation practices. So for example, here it's looking at developing evaluation practices for volunteering. So I'm just going to go through one example of one of these papers to essentially show you other ways that user-centered design can be applied and the kind of the different metrics and approaches you can take. So this paper by Ortiz and Crespo, they applied a user-centered design approach to design an advisory service to contribute to sustainable intensification in Tanzania. And just so we're all familiar with the concept, sustainable intensification is where you want to increase yield, but with no adverse environmental impacts and no additional conversion of non-agricultural land. And they specifically wanted this service to reduce aflatoxin contamination, which is a toxin produced by fungi. And they wanted to reduce this toxin contamination in groundnut crops. So in order to do this, the authors applied 5 steps for user-centered design. So as with the example I showed you earlier, they explored the context. So here the authors carried out interviews with 15 smallholder farmers who lived in the locality, and these farmers had been previously shown to successfully implement sustainable intensification practices. They also undertook 2 interviews with individuals who worked in a similar agricultural advisory service. And from these interviews, the authors really wanted to understand how information flowed between these 2 user groups, as well as how information was accessed. They also wanted to know about farmers' preferences for channels of communication, so that could inform their design, and any limitations associated with any of these processes. So by undertaking these steps, the authors decided that a mobile phone-based service would be most appropriate. The interviews with the farmers showed that the farmers did engage with radio and TV broadcasts, but it was hard for them to fit those broadcasts into their daily routines. And additionally, direct calls to agricultural advisors were a widespread way of accessing information, but during peak agricultural season, there was such a high demand for access that it was hard for the farmers to gain access to that information. So these and other insights led to the initial design, which included pre-recorded audio messages, which the farmers could access on demand, as well as phone calls. So by pulling together the insights from the interviews, as well as drawing on the literature on sustainable intensification, the authors defined 6 core design requirements which needed to be met in the new service. And these requirements were to be context specific, to include diverse perspectives, be adaptable, resource efficient, available, and accountable. In order to meet these kind of design requirements, particular design decisions were made. So for example, looking at adaptability, any questions that were submitted by a farmer would be tagged with a keyword by the agricultural advisors. And this would allow the advisors to see any kind of emerging needs, which could then be addressed by the inclusion of one of these pre-recorded messages. And these design decisions resulted in a kind of semi-specific design to which the authors created different prototypes. And they then hosted sessions with farmers and advisors, observing their behavior and reactions when they interacted with these prototypes, as well as any misunderstandings that might have occurred. And user discussions determined kind of different characteristics of the service. So you can see here, this is the menu of the pre-recorded messages. And in the user discussions, they determined that there shouldn't be any more than 5 options to choose from at a time. So that was something that was incorporated into the design of the service. And these sessions resulted in the Ushari information service, which you can see here. So we have the farmers providing, submitting questions to the advisors, and the advisors would be able to answer those questions via automated calls, and also the farmers being able to access those pre-recorded advisory messages. So to evaluate this service that they'd designed, the authors undertook a pilot project which lasted 28 days. And this involved 97 farmers and 2 advisors. There were 8 advisors originally involved, but due to poor internet connectivity, only 2 were able to take part. And both groups were given training in the service, and farmers were also given airtime credits so they could access the service for free at no charge to themselves. And the frequency and duration of calls, as well as kind of other metrics, were gathered. So, for example, during the pilot phase, advisors received 92 different questions from farmers. And as the advisors had the ability to record and save questions, save answers to these questions, they only actually had to record 33 replies to these 92 different questions. And this was much more efficient than similar services where the advisors would directly call every individual who had asked a question. So it was a great time saving there. And among other evaluation measures, farmers who were involved in the pilot were asked to evaluate the service using a system usability score. And this ranged from 0 to 100. It was made up of 10 statements, each with a Likert scale. And the farmers actually gave the system a score of 80, which was between good and excellent. So in conclusion, the authors felt the service actually successfully contributed to sustainable intensification practices, as well as the use of user-centered design, enabling the creation of a service that fitted into the local context. And the authors also commented that by engaging the advisors kind of throughout the process, this fostered a sense of ownership as well. So it's quite a positive example of the use of user-centered design there. So lastly, I just wanted to share some thoughts that I'd had while undertaking this research, the case study I mentioned earlier, but also actually in the preparation of this presentation. So just in terms of design and conservation specifically, I think if we can design apps, websites, etc., which are useful for conservation practitioners and are able to provide access to different types of knowledges, I think this will be really beneficial in further integrating conservation research and practice. So I think this is a really good way that design could contribute to the uptake of different knowledges by conservation practitioners. And I was just wondering, can we learn anything from design thinking? So is there any way we could apply design thinking to our own scholarship as conservation researchers and practitioners? And so I'm sure you've all heard of wicked problems, so the multifaceted problems involving a variety of stakeholders who all have different values. And this phrase actually originated in design thinking, as first mentioned by Buchanan in 1992. And again, is there anything in the design literature around wicked problems which could inform our own thinking? And next, Sean is describing designers as deliberately involving themselves in messy but crucially important problems. And when asked to describe their methods of inquiry, they speak of experience, trial and error, intuition, and muddling through. And for me, I'd love to get everybody else's thoughts on this, but for me, this really speaks to conservation practice. And within Sean's book, The Reflective Practitioner, How Professionals Think in Action, he talks about how different professionals essentially know more than they can put into words. And this last quote at the bottom by B.N. Sanders. So she says, seeing and appreciating, and this is from a paper about participatory design, seeing and appreciating what people dream shows us how their future can change for the better. It is another form of tacit knowledge that can reveal latent needs. i.e. needs not recognizable until the future. And again, for me, this really speaks to kind of transformative change, and specifically how envisioning the future can help us understand what we need to do in the now. So this kind of just got me thinking, maybe there are some techniques or writings within the design field that we could utilize in conservation. I feel like I whizzed through that very quickly, so sorry for that. These are the references that I used, and I just wanted to say thank you to all the participants that took part in the case study, the BRCA1 study. We couldn't have done it without them, as well as to my colleagues at the Winton Centre, at the Genomic Laboratory Hub and the Genetics Service, who offered us their expertise. Lauren Capuccione is a master's student who helped with the BRCA project, so thank you to her, and also to the charities and organisations who helped with recruitment and funding. So yeah, that's everything from me. And if anyone's got any questions about user-centered design, or I'd also be really interested in maybe how you feel you could use these approaches in your own work if you can, but also what I mentioned at the end, kind of maybe using design thinking in our own practices as well. I'd really like to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Alice. Are there any questions? You can pop them in the chat or put on your camera and ask away. Hi, Teresa.
I have some questions, but they're not urgent ones. So if anyone's got better questions, then they should ask theirs before me. I always feel bad like saying a question first. I feel like, anyway, I'll just ask my question. Okay, so first of all, so this is just like a question because I'm nosy and it sounds interesting, but you said that you wish you'd sort of paid more attention to the diversity of participants with like hard to reach groups that weren't included. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because that's who I like try and work with, is really sort of marginalized and hard to reach groups. And then secondly, so for my work, I was going to do usability testing of a website, and the website brings together a whole like big broad network of research on plastic. And so I've made it digestible, and then I want to share that with waste workers as a way to get them interested in plastic research, but also to improve the design. So I was thinking, out of all that you said, then the most appropriate sounds like using a system usability score. Would you agree with that, or is there something else I should do instead?
Yeah, sure. So with regards to the first question, I think, yeah, it was, to be honest, it's like really appalling. So we had something like, how many participants for the interviews did we have? There were a lot, and we literally only had like 2 non-white participants, and afterwards I was just like, what this is really bad. So that's something that we've, as I said, improved on for further studies. So we've been doing studies around communicating COVID risks, and in that we've actually just essentially used our social networks to get people involved. So I'm not sure if that's completely helpful for you, but I know there is a massive amount of literature on reaching hard to reach groups, and I know especially in genetics, I mean, I'm assuming you're not doing genetics research, but maybe it's still useful anyway. In genetics research, it's typically really hard to engage particular sets of users, and there's been a lot of thinking about that. So maybe in that literature there might be something useful in there. I can definitely, because I can think of a few papers off the top of my head, I could send those to you if that would be helpful.
Great, yeah.
I think this project has really just shown me the benefit of transdisciplinary thinking. So like using different approaches and methods in one discipline in another. So yeah, I can definitely have a look at that for you. And so in terms of your website, I would say the thing that I found to be most beneficial was actually talking to users, so undertaking those semi-structured interviews, because then you had that time to really understand where they were coming from, what worked for them, what didn't. And I think that was insanely valuable, because obviously you have the benefits from using quantitative metrics, but you get such a deep, like rich understanding from undertaking interviews. So from my perspective, if you had the time, I think that would be a really valuable thing to be able to do.
My original plan was to use focus groups. So I would actually ask people, can you go and find, read this page, and then can you tell me one thing that the government's advising you to do with recycling, or tell me something that, so get people to do tasks to interact with it. But then, yeah, that wasn't grounded in anything other than me just, having done a lot of qualitative research and focus groups. It wasn't, so this is useful for actually being able to explain what I want to do using like design thinking principles.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
No, my pleasure.
And Simon, do you have a question?
I do. I must apologise for not making the beginning, so I came in sort of during, and so I'd be really interested if it's possible to get a copy of the presentation or some further information.
Well, we are recording the session.
Oh,
yeah, it will be available, and if Alice is all right with that, to share her presentation.
Or some further information, but I'm working to support conservation in Liberia at the moment. And for example, one of the projects we're working on is to develop a illegal wildlife trade database for use by the authorities and ideally for all the stakeholders. So I wondered if you thought that your principles and your method might be useful there, but also in general for consulting with communities, whether you think, I didn't see the method unfortunately, so I don't know, but I like the idea of user-centered design, or maybe the terminology's changed, but involving people that are going to use something in the design, it seems to make sense.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely does make sense. Like Carmen said, there's going to be a recording, so hopefully that will be useful for you. But I can also give you my email and send you some more resources if you think that would be useful. And in terms of the database, I think it sounds like a perfect opportunity to use user-centered design approaches. I think that would be, in my opinion, really valuable. So yeah, go for it. And in terms of the communities, I've been finding that because we have in conservation, there's been this kind of evolution of participatory approaches, right? And I think that's kind of been mirrored in the design world as well, where they've gone from just involving the user to involving all the stakeholders to actually collaborating with the stakeholders and just being a facilitator. And I feel like conservation has mirrored that evolution as well. So I think there is definitely some more participatory approaches you can use that from design in designing or collaborating with different stakeholders to design a product. And there are lots of kind of facilitation techniques you can use, different ways to engage communities or the stakeholders with your product, and like acting, loads of all these different techniques that you can use to try and further understand what people want and also to engage them in the process.
That's very good. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I guess that is a good time to wrap it up. So thank you very much, Alice. That was great. And before we sign off, I'd like to plug a few events from our institute, the Conservation Research Institute. So for starters, next Thursday, we have a weekly networking morning at 11, and we will be joined by Professor Jeremy Wilson, who is the head of conservation science for RSPB. On that same Thursday and then on to Friday, we will be running a 2-day session on a media workshop as part of our early career researcher program. Each session will be held from 9:15 to 1. There's still a few spots available, so if you would like to register for that, that would be great. It's a great opportunity to sort of work with some ex-BBC presenters and producers. And finally, it's still a while away, but on Saturday, the 27th of March, we have our Cambridge Festival event, Citizen Science. And it's an interactive family fun event that we're basically asking people to send us photos of the wildlife that they observe in their everyday. They might not be sure what it is. It'd be great, especially for children who are curious about nature. They can send it in to us via iRecord. And then on the actual day of the event, on the 27th, a panel of wildlife experts will have a look at the photos, identify them, discuss them. And yeah, just it's informative, education and fun. So instead of bombarding you with all the links of all these events, I'm just going to put the link for our website, which has all the events, all the details of how to sign up. So I'll just put that in the chat and then, yeah. And yes, I will send around an email that will provide Alice's contact details and the link to our YouTube channel. So I hope to see all of you at the next ECR workshop. Teresa, do you have a question? Or...
Oh, no. Oh, sorry, I unmuted myself. So I was just going to say goodbye.
Okay, all right, we're all ready to say goodbye.
Just being polite.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Alice, and everyone have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.